Welcome to the Commsversations podcast, where we break down communications strategy, storytelling, and the future of comms. And now, here is your host, Enrico Dinges.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Commsversations podcast. I'm your host, Enrico Dinges. Today is our inaugural episode, episode 1, and I'm so excited to have a very special guest joining us. For our first episode, I wanted to talk about this intersection between leadership and communications. Every organization that understands that intersection, leaders who really buy into the importance and the power of communications and helping them achieve whatever their organization's goals are, whether that's improving the bottom line, or getting more brand awareness, or, protecting their reputation, will resource and support that function within an organization at the right levels. That's why I think leadership and that intersection with communications is so important. Today, I've invited Steve Cox, who's the CEO and president of Rappahannock Goodwill Industries. He brings over 30 years of experience in both leadership and in communications roles. Couldn't think of a better person to bring onto the program. He's a good friend, and I've known him for over 10 years now. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Enrico, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be working with you again, and I look forward to the opportunity. So thank you.
It's been great to be in touch and hear your journey. It's going to be very relevant today. And my goal is for our audience to have some takeaways in understanding what qualities are important in leadership, and particularly in the function of communications within an organization. Before we jump in and talk shop, I wanted to enter a little segment of getting to know you. All right, Steve. So where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I went to elementary school there. Went to, I guess at the time, middle school there. Moved across the state to Chattanooga. Ended up going to high school and college in Chattanooga. And then ultimately out the door and into the Marine Corps. But we'll get to that point. So let's not get ahead of ourselves.
And so went to high school in Chattanooga. What was Steve Cox doing in high school? Were you into sports? What activities were you doing there?
Yeah, good question. Well, you're taking me back here. I would say this. I kind of felt like I was, average middle class kid in high school. I didn't necessarily do anything extraordinary or out of the ordinary. I would probably characterize myself as a pretty good student. Got some A's, got some B's. I was probably more in the B range than the A range. I was a sports kid, enjoyed, playing sports, as a child growing up and then in high school. I was also that kid. And this was kind of, this probably dates me because I was the kid who, you played whatever sport the season was. So if it was basketball season, you're playing that. If it's football season, you're playing that. I know kids today tend to specialize. But back then it was whatever the season was, that's what you played, and that's what I did. Played into high school, varsity athlete, good enough to be on the varsity team, good enough to start in basketball, not good enough to go anywhere with it. Too short and couldn't jump high enough and not accurate enough with the shot, but I enjoyed the experience.
You were the Bo Jackson of Chattanooga. Multi-sports.
I don't know about that. That's funny.
I bring up high school as I think it's an important inflection point for a lot of people in terms of their awareness of leadership, right? Because you start to be on teams and you have the captain of the football team or the principal of the high school or particular teachers. And so you begin to get a sense of leadership styles. And so I thought I'd ask you if there's anybody or that you can remember from high school that looking back on now was impactful as a leader, or that maybe there was something about their approach to leadership that maybe stayed with you that you think back on?
I would say this. I don't know that there was an individual necessarily, like at my high school. I would say this. I felt like I took and still apply, a lot of cues from my father. And really the takeaway there was focus. It was hard work. It was get the job done. It was quality. It was do your best. It was don't quit. It was that type of leadership by example, if you think about it that way. And I had the opportunity as a high school senior on the basketball team to be named the captain of the team. Now, what did that mean when you're 17 years old? I don't know. But what I applied were the lessons that I learned from my father. It was like, well, I can do leadership by example. when we're running the sprints, I can run hard. I can run it all the way out. I can show up early. I can stay a little late. I can lead by example without necessarily knowing all the nuances and intricacies of leadership. So I give you that as kind of an early experience, maybe an early application of what I had learned by observing growing up in our family, and then how I applied that in my first leadership role as the captain of the basketball team.
No, that makes perfect sense, Steve. I think you're right. Now you bring it up, that maybe your first exposure is in your home and just seeing how your parents lead within the family dynamic and their styles. So leading by example, I think it makes a lot of sense. And what that does for you as a leader in the future. You finish winning all state football or whatever it is. You graduate and you start looking at sort of the future, right? At 18, and I think that's where the Marine Corps comes into your life. Can you talk about that next step in your career journey?
Absolutely. It was kind of an interesting transition because I had played sports growing up. I'd always been part of a team, and I liked that, and I enjoyed that dynamic, and I enjoyed the camaraderie, and I enjoyed the competition aspect of it. Oddly, perhaps, I liked practicing. That could jump us way ahead into a communications conversation where you got to love the process, and I like the process. I like the process of sports. But there came a point there after the basketball season where it was over. That was it. There wasn't going to be another season. There wasn't another team. And while I had designs on going to college, there was that gap or that void around next step team. And I will tell you, I saw a Marine Corps recruiter. I had never in my life thought about, wow, I'd really like to join the Marine Corps. I had some, deep patriotic vision. I didn't have that. Okay. I saw a Marine Corps recruiter. I was impressed by the young man. I was impressed by the uniform. I was impressed by the way he carried himself and presented himself, and thought, that's pretty interesting. Let me talk to this guy. Had the conversation, and while we talked about going to boot camp and skills you learn and what you would do as an occupational specialty, kind of what I heard was team and process and discipline, and those were the types of things that resonated with me, and those were the types of things that ultimately kind of drew me into the Marine Corps. And I promise you, I got all that and a lot more. But I think the reasons I was drawn to the Marine Corps, at least for me at that time, were the right reasons. And I kind of got what I paid for, so to speak. I got the payoff for it.
What I think you did was you ran into a fantastic spokesperson for the Marine Corps who utilized an incredible communication strategy to convince you to join. No, but I think recruitment really is, sort of the face of an organization when you think about it that way. And so, for it to have that impact on you speaks to the efforts that the Marines and other branches of the service put into that recruitment process. I mean, I think it's probably elite when you think about it in terms of communications and convincing people to buy into a vision.
Well, and I can tell you, subsequently later on in my career, ended up serving not as a recruiter myself. I was in charge of Marine Corps recruiting in Central California, Northern California, Western Nevada. And you're right, it is a process, and there's a lot of parts to the process, not the least of which is the ability to communicate. And it's the ability to translate a leadership vision, but also an organizational requirement into and through communications to drive action.
That's fantastic. So you went into the Marines as an enlisted, and I know we both served in the Gulf War, so we sort of missed each other, but we were part of the same mission, part of the same team. And then subsequently in your career, at some point, you became an officer in the Marine Corps. And I wanted to ask you, was that something that somebody saw in you and approached you, or was it something you saw in yourself and said, here's an opportunity and let me take it? How did you make that transition from enlisted to officer?
Probably a little bit of both to your point about someone seeing something in me that I might not have recognized, but me also trying to think, what does my next step look like? What does advancement look like? I will admit that I certainly, respected the officers that I was in contact with, but also I was impressed by the officers that I was in contact with, impressed by their leadership, by their communication skills, by their poise, by their presence, by their discipline. And it was one of our senior enlisted Marines who suggested to me, because I was taking college courses at the time while I was an enlisted Marine, who suggested, "Hey, have you thought about this? Maybe something you want to think about in the in the years to come." And I did, and ultimately applied for the program. Didn't realize at the time specifically how competitive it was, or frankly how perhaps lucky I was to be selected, because I applied for the program and I was selected, and I thought, well, that's great. That's how this works. That's awesome. And then ultimately moved into the into the officer training, and then was commissioned as a second lieutenant after I completed college.
And on in that training, what do you recall being some of the top 2, 3 points of leadership that they shared with you or taught you at that school?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple that come immediately to mind that I carry with me today, and I've carried with me in every role that I've had, whether it was in the Marine Corps or outside of the Marine Corps. The first really is self-reliance, meaning just that belief in yourself, in your own capabilities. You are in charge of yourself. You're responsible for yourself. And that idea of self-reliance really will take you a long way. I mean, if you don't believe in yourself, why would anybody else?
Right.
And so self-reliance really does go a long way. It's one of those things it's a bit iterative, and you build on it over time. You may start with a glimmer or a flicker of it, but you got to go prove it to yourself, and then prove it again and again. So self-reliance was a key. The other thing that I really took away from the officer training was around accountability, and then authority and responsibility. Accountability, I mean, as a leader, you're responsible for everything your unit or your organization does or fails to do.
Right.
You're accountable, and you have to be accountable. And then authority and responsibility, as a leader, you can delegate authority, but you can't delegate the responsibility, meaning you are responsible. And those couple of points there around accountability, authority, responsibility, kind of drilled into us as young Marine Corps officers. But I think the reality is those are life lessons. Those aren't just Marine Corps lessons or Marine officer lessons. Those are leader lessons that can span a lifetime, regardless of where you're leading or who you're leading.
Now I heard, and I need to confirm this with you, but there is this approach in the Marine Corps that, like at mess, when you're getting food, the officers wait to eat last. They let their enlisted men eat first. Opposite of the Army, where you have to let people cut in and get in. So two different leadership styles there for sure. But is that a fact? That part of the
that is a fact. And there's the Marine Corps has its principles of leadership. One of the key principles of leadership, and I'll use a generic term, it's take care of your men. And in this particular context, in terms of food, well, take care of your men. Men eat first, then you eat. And that's just the way it was done. That was the expectation, and frankly, I think it makes a lot of sense, whether it's in the Marine Corps or outside of the Marine Corps. Take care of your team, take care of your people, and your people will take care of you. And I think that applies, broadly in terms of leadership. It's a good illustration, though.
For sure. So when you became an officer, at some point, public affairs role came into your life. And so I wanted to ask you, was that something you sought out? Or again, was that something that was an opportunity that somebody approached you with that you jumped at?
Yeah, it was a career transition that I sought out. As an enlisted Marine, I served in the artillery, the big cannons. That's what I was doing. As a younger Marine Corps officer, I was an infantry officer. So, on the ground, front line, I was that guy. As I got more seasoned in my career, I started thinking beyond my career in the Marine Corps, and felt like, I wanted to be able to move into the civilian environment. I wanted to be able to move into the business environment. So I started thinking about what might that career look like. I'll be honest with you, I narrowed it down to two tracks. It was finance or communications. Fortunately, I chose communications. I mean, I'm reasonable at finance, but I don't know that you want me doing your taxes for you. Okay, so I was fortunate to be able to make a career transition while in the Marine Corps from the infantry field into the public affairs field, and a great experience. Just a tremendous growth opportunity for me, great learning opportunity for me. But it also gave me the platform to use that as my kind of my transition point or my jump off point into what's turned out to be my second 20-year career outside of the Marine Corps.
Well, that's wonderful. And I think there are points in your career in communications where you can be as prepared and experienced as you want to be, but situations come that you have to manage that are difficult, crises, issues. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was in your career was Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, at the point where, we were sending POWs essentially, that were captured in the theater in Afghanistan and other places. Very controversial topic. The world news was covering this. And here's Steve Cox in Cuba, charged with managing the media relations, that. And I would just love to tap your brain and talk shop on what that experience was like, and how do you prepare and execute something on that scale? And was that the first sort of global scale issue you had to manage for the Marines?
It was, and it was quite the one to be the first one. So
Right.
I'll give you just a little bit of setup, and then I'll touch on a couple of points, and then we can take the conversation wherever you would want to. I had made my career transition. I'd gone to the public affairs school, graduated the public affairs school. So I go down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I'd been there, 2 months, and 9/11 hit. And then the first U.S. forces that departed to Afghanistan, other than special forces operators, the first mainstream traditional forces came out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So here I am, 3 months or less out of my initial training, and now I'm the Marine Corps spokesperson at Camp Lejeune for deployment of Marines to Afghanistan. And it wasn't long after that. I mean, it was several weeks after that ultimately the decision was made that we would stand at the terrorist detention facility in Guantanamo Bay. And I was tapped to go be the public affairs officer for that. But what that meant was I was going to be the United States spokesperson,
Correct,
on the ground at Guantanamo Bay. And I'll be honest with you, my reaction at the time was like, is everybody sure about this? Is this really, what you all want to do? Because I've been doing this for like 4 months.
wow.
But I'll tell you what served me well was having been an infantry officer and an enlisted artilleryman, and having done operations and having deployed and having served in the Gulf War. I had a lot more background and experience and expertise perhaps than I was giving myself credit for, in order to be able to then articulate what was happening at Guantanamo Bay, what the issues were, what the dynamics were, what the concerns were. But I would say this, and you touched on this up front. There was intense worldwide scrutiny when we started the terrorist detention facility there. It was principally critical of U.S. operations. There was just a negative narrative, particularly with the international media. We were offering what I'll call limited access, at least initially. It was kind of a, hey, take our word for it, which is never a good approach. But that was kind of where we were initially at the outset of that operation. And then that raised concern at, frankly, some of the highest levels of the Department of Defense and the U.S. government about the optics of what was going on at Gitmo.
Right.
And, the initial reaction around it was really, okay, well, let's further limit access. Okay, let's choose that course here. All right, if they don't like what we're giving them, then we won't give them anything. Unfortunately, I did not feel like that was going to be the correct tact on that. And I made the recommendation, and I made it strongly, that instead of limiting access, we need to increase access. I mean, from a media perspective, we need to let the media see it, hear it, feel
Right.
it, taste it,
Right.
smell it, and then report on it to the maximum extent possible. Now, I mean, let's be honest, Guantanamo Bay was a top secret environment, so there's only so much that can be shared. But my feeling was the more we can share, the better, because I think that gives us the best chance of getting what I'll call fair reporting
Right.
out of the scenario. And ultimately, we did do that. And I will give my boss, who was the general in charge, credit, not for listening to me, but for, from his leadership perspective, in terms of his calculus and his risk management, in terms of the communications course of action that I was proposing. He chose to pursue it, and he backed me up with it. He 100% backed me up with it. And I'm not going to tell you everything was perfect and everything worked exactly like you'd like it to. But at the end of the day, when you go months down the road, we ended up with less critical coverage, more favorable coverage. We ended up with more comprehensive reporting on the operations, and I think we ultimately improved our media relations, operation, meaning just the relationship with the media. Right. So I think we took what was a particularly intense and particularly hostile situation and made it less intense and less hostile. I'm not going to tell you it was the absolute friendliest place in the world, because it wasn't. But still, I think by choosing a communications course of action and having leadership back up that communications course of action, we were able to materially impact the operation.
No, I can't imagine the scrutiny from the White House, globally, other, leaders of the world looking at what was happening there and being the face of that. What a daunting experience. But no, and I think that's why you need public relations practitioners that kind of understand both the ethics of PR and in terms of that relationship with reporters, but also the understanding that the more you obfuscate, the more questions actually you draw from the media, and or in that gap, they'll create their own narratives. And so the more exposure, you're right, Steve. And that was a great recommendation to say, let's just open up. Maybe uncomfortable, but at least we'll have a way to justify our responses to questions that may come up from what they're exposed to, versus trying to respond to things in a vacuum. So,
And to that point,
yeah,
it's often, and I'm sure you've experienced this over your career as well. It's it's easy to have that hunker down reaction, like, oh, it's not going well. Let's hunker down. And it's almost counterintuitive to say, okay, things are not going the way we'd like it to go, so let's open up. That's risky. That sounds very
hmm
risky. And then I'll also offer that there's often this idea that says, well, we need a better message. We just need better messaging. It's like if we said it differently, then they will accept it. And oftentimes it's not necessarily that you need a better message. What you really need is better execution.
right. Any accountability or an admission that, okay, this is something that needs to be looked into or fixed or accept the criticism sometimes.
Mhm.
Just recently to the whole Coldplay situation that happened with the CEO of Astronomer, and people are like, take responsibility. Like you said, sometimes it's the reaction because you feel like the message or it's not going away, but then the things that you do just exacerbate it.
Yeah, and I'm in no position to comment on Astronomer or the Coldplay concert or
Sure.
what happened and who did what to who. But your point about accountability is well taken, and we all know from a public relations and communications perspective, there's a long road littered with folks who didn't take accountability. When if they just stepped forward at the outset and said, you know what, yep, did it, my mistake, my fault. Here's what I'm going to do about it, and here's the direction we're going to go. They'd have probably been a lot better off.
For sure. So, Steve, you had 20 years, great career in the Marines, decided to retire and make this transition. And like you said, I think it was great that you had the foresight to think, okay, what am I going to do after the Marines? And prepared yourself, well for that, both in terms of education side, but also the experience side and getting into public affairs. So what did you do once you retired? Where did you land?
Yeah, I will tell you, I did not want to stay in kind of that military industrial complex. I really wanted to get into business ultimately.
Mhm.
And, first step out of the Marine Corps was consulting. So I went to Booz Allen Hamilton. I was a strategic communications consultant. And I knew going in that was going to be a bit of a grind, and that's not any knock on Booz Allen. That's what consulting is.
Sure, for sure.
And
I'm sure everybody listening will agree with you.
right. And that was fine with me because what I wanted as much opportunity, exposure to clients, different sets of problems as I could possibly get, frankly, in as short a time period as I could get them, because I wanted to, kind of energize and supercharge my second career. But I'll make this point about having gone to Booz Allen and having done consulting. For as much as the Marine Corps probably taught me kind of how to be, I felt like my experience at Booz Allen really taught me how to think.
Mm.
And I think that was a value of Booz Allen, but I think that's also a value of consulting, whether it's around, just critical assessment. It's correlating variables, thinking in combinations. How do things work together? How do things integrate? How do things flow together? It taught me to ask the question, what are we trying to achieve? Which seems like a pretty basic question, but it is astounding how many times when you ask that question, folks can't quite articulate that. So it's a pretty grounding question strategically for an organization, or maybe it's just even tactically. What are we trying to achieve? It's a very focusing question. And I certainly found that as a consultant, and I think this ultimately applies to leadership going forward, you don't necessarily have to have all the answers, but you have to know what questions to ask. So the question, what are we trying to achieve, or why is that important? Why is that important now? Well, what are we trying to achieve? Now, what are you willing to do to get it? I mean, those are some very focusing and grounding questions. And again, I think those apply broadly to leadership, but I'll also tell you they work pretty well in communications.
No, for sure. I think always the basic of a communications plan. Who's your audience? Who are you really trying to reach? And then what are the channels to best reach them? So maybe a press release isn't the way to go, or maybe national media may not be the way to go. What you're looking at is a trade public, so those are the questions that lead you to the right tactics, and approach for sure. I do wonder the transition to the civilian world. So clearly in the military, there's a chain of command. There's certainly a lot of inherent, like you respect your leadership, whether reporting to a gunnery sergeant or then, up the chain. Then you go into a civilian world where, yeah, there's leadership, but, you can question things. And in fact, your courage to sort of maybe be a little bit to question an approach or a tactic to try to get to the best solution. So I wanted to get your experience on that, like going from just people reacting to what you provide as an order versus, okay, here's what I want to achieve. And people are questioning that a little bit, or, I find that always fascinating for members of the military, particularly leadership styles coming into that.
Yeah, a couple of things I'll throw out to you on that. And those are really good points because um, there's some truth to this, but I think there's also a bit of a misconception about military leadership that it is just based on positional authority. You're in the position, you do as I say. Well, that's kind of a yes, but there is a strong aspect of positional authority associated with rank in the military environment, much like what I've experienced in my transition into the civilian workforce. There's still a requirement for influence, for being an influential leader. And while you may have positional authority, in a military environment, if you can't influence people, maybe in parentheses put motivate people, your organization is not going to be successful. So I think the key there really is around the ability to influence folks toward, the vision or the goal or the strategy or whatever the particular case may be. And I'll throw out just a couple of things that I think kind of go into that influential leadership space. I think the first is adaptability, and you've touched on that with a couple of your comments. Man, if you're a leader who's not adaptable, you're probably not a leader. You just have to be adaptable to be a successful leader. Accountability, I touched on that earlier as a kind of an early on lesson that I learned, but I think that just goes part and parcel with leadership. Leaders are accountable. You have to be accountable. Your people expect you to be accountable. If you're not accountable, you're probably not a leader. I'll throw out two other things. I think emotional intelligence probably gets a little bit undersold. Sounds kind of squishy. What is it? We could have a whole interesting conversation about emotional intelligence. And it may be one of the most difficult qualities to, I don't know, learn or necessarily influence it, or influence. But I would say there's that aspect of being able to, listen, be empathetic, understand, and then take action. It's kind of, I have a kind of a phrase I like to use with folks. It's listen, learn, and then lead. And I think emotional intelligence kind of falls into that space. The last of maybe the four qualities here that I'll throw out to you that I think kind of transition, whether it's military service or into the civilian community, is effective communication. Leaders almost by definition are effective communicators. A lot of ways to be an effective communicator, but if you're not an effective communicator, man, it's going to be hard to lead. Communication is a skill. We can all get better at it. No matter where you're at in the continuum, communication is a skill that we can all get better at. But man, it makes a huge difference when a leader's a really good communicator. They can get the word across. They can keep it simple. They can make it concise. They can motivate people. People can get inspired by it. Communication really, really is a key skill set for a leader.
No, I love that, Steve. I love that. To listen, learn, and lead. I think that really makes a lot of sense. And I've read books on emotional IQ and have this always, I think it's going to be hard to resolve, whether it's something that's just inherent, you're born with it, and it's easier for some people. I think you can learn some of it. The question is interesting, between is it inherent in certain leaders? Do you see that sort of commonality? Particularly, I think, in how you react to situations. I think that's where emotional IQ really comes into play. And as a leader, when the business isn't hitting its numbers, when there's a crisis of some kind, it's interesting to see the leaders that have that calmness about them, or that emotional intelligence about them to get through those and navigate those while everybody's panicking and hair on fire trying to solve the situation, make it go away.
I agree with you on that. Just that idea of, kind of grace under pressure. And, a team will generally mimic the attitude, the behavior of the leader. Leaders calm, teams calm. Leaders panicky, teams panicky. And it doesn't matter if you're on a battlefield, you're in a boardroom, or you're on site at an event, running a public relations function. the team will mimic the leader. So there, you are absolutely on to something with that idea of grace under pressure.
Steve, you moved on from Booz Allen and went to the Better Business Bureau. And if I recall, it was in a communications role, leadership role. You're vice president there. And then became the president CEO of the Better Business Bureau at a time when there was a bit of controversy or attention being placed on really one of the core missions of the Better Business Bureau, which is this third-party validation of businesses that was being called into question. What strikes me first is I don't find it very common that within an organization, those that are internally selected to become like the CEO or the president come from the comms side of the house. They tend to come from the operations or it's a chief financial officer. So to me, it's remarkable. Now, I know you had the background in terms of an education. You can kind of talk about what you achieved there on the business side with an MBA, but I was kind of like, hey, one for the team, a comms person that actually is selected within a company to then lead that organization. But it made perfect sense that you'd be the right guy at the right time, considering what was the focus at that time. But can you talk a little bit about your experience there at the Better Business Bureau?
I had the good fortune to be in the right place at the right time to move into that CEO role. And it was an organization that was in transition, kind of moving into the digital age at that time. So there were a number of different initiatives that we wanted to pursue strategically, that were, communications based. And then you alluded to, we had one of our, larger member organizations not doing things in accordance with the membership standards. And unfortunately that garnered first local media attention, then that kind of morphed into some national media attention. And of course that then starts to call into question, well, if they're doing it, what else is going on and who else is doing it? What are you guys doing? So there was the requirement to address it. And you can take your pick here of what strategy you're trying to pursue or what tactic you want to pursue within that strategy. What we chose to do was we said, okay, we're going to address it. We're going to take it head on, and we will take it head on with the truth, which is sometimes painful. It just is. But the thought being, it is much better to be truthful, be transparent to the maximum extent possible, and then move forward from there. Because we've all seen scenarios where you got to start pulling the truth out of an organization or out of a person. Maybe you get the answer, but now you doubt the answer, and then you wonder what they're not telling you. So, again, our tactic was, let's take this head on. Let's be completely truthful, and then as transparent as we can possibly be, and then try and move forward from that point. And ultimately, the organization was able to do that. Now, I won't tell you it was easy going through it, because it wasn't. And everybody who's been through that type of, crisis communication scenario, or your brand integrity gets called into question, those things are difficult. They're very difficult. It takes time to move through that process. You don't do one interview and everything's good. It takes time thereafter. And really what the key to getting the issue resolved lies in is more about action than words. You've got to deliver the words up front, but then you've got to back up those words with action thereafter. And that was really the basis for our approach was, okay, we're going to be truthful. We're going to be transparent. And now here's what we're going to do in terms of action steps going forward, to move forward and frankly move away from that particular issue.
Well, I go back to the point you made, a right person, right time. And you might have had another CEO in that position who might have been reticent to being transparent. But I think you as a communicator and your experience in Guantanamo Bay, I'm probably should inform some of this, and the leader who listened to you then to make that happen. So being the right person at the right time for that organization, I think is a great way to put it.
Yeah, a little bit of serendipity never hurts, Enrico.
A little, yeah, for sure. My question, and throughout my career, when we've had these situations, crisis that might involve a little bit of liability, particularly legal liability, is trying to get general counsel, the lawyers on board with your communication message. And curious if in this situation and others, what that relationship was like. How do you get buying into a message that might admit some wrongdoing that could pose, a bit of liability from a litigation standpoint, which it's the lawyer's jobs to try to prevent and put the company in the best position to win that litigation. And so it's always an interesting dynamic that I've seen throughout my career in communications, that relationship between your lawyers.
Yeah, I would say, and that's it's difficult to navigate, and that doesn't mean lawyers are difficult. It's, as you alluded to, I completely understand the dynamic of, risk, potential liability, what you say can and will be used against you, those types of things. And you got to navigate that process. But it has been my experience, and I would advocate against hunkering down and saying nothing, because you just end up in a churn that, while you may well win the court case if it gets to there, but in the meantime, the damage done to the organization, it can take years to unwind. It absolutely could take years to unwind. And I would tell you, having worked in a top secret environment, there's always something you can say. And in fact, there's always something you should say. There just is. That doesn't mean you can say everything all the time, but to say nothing almost never works.
Right, right. It leaves a vacuum for sure, and more questions for sure. Uh, Steve, we can go through the rest of your career, but I want to be mindful of time. I'll just say that our lives crossed paths when your next step in your journey, you came to Sodexo. And I know when you came on board there, the focus was really on trying to be strategic storytellers for the organization. And since we had 15 million customers every day in every environment there, from hospitals and universities and schools and government, even military, providing food services and facilities management, we were touch points. And what was important for that organization to grow was to really talk about the impact we had in the communities there that we served. I wanted to touch a little briefly on that approach of being a leader within the community, to have the ability to really impact those communities, but then strategically using those efforts in storytelling to help improve the brand within a community. And so I just want to ask you to touch base a little bit on that communications approach.
Yeah, sure. A couple of things I'll mention to you up front. You touched on the Sodexo, great company, global Fortune 500 company, very complex, different countries, different cultures, different languages, different time zones. And I will say this, one of the key lessons I learned at Sodexo was, man, you have got to be a simplifier. Don't be a complicator. Be a simplifier. No one likes the complicator. Be the simplifier. And that really works. And that was a leadership lesson for me, but that was also a communications lesson for me, because as you alluded to, one of the things we were trying to do across North America was help the communities that we served in understand who we were, what we do, what the impact is. We had the Sodexo Foundation focused on ending childhood hunger, and that we had a lot of things that we brought to the table in communities that were somewhat invisible to the communities that we served. So that idea of simplifying, was a key tenet in how we rolled out our community relations effort, how we structured our media relations activities, how we engaged from a digital perspective. It was very crisp, very clear, very clean in terms of who we are, what we do, what the impact is, and then how we can work together, to create a better community. So I think that, the takeaway there was around being a simplifier in what was a complex dynamic, because as you'll recall, we were moving into different cities from a communications perspective. We
Right,
were
right.
operating there, but trying to create essentially public-private partnerships. We're Sodexo, the company, engaging with a local nonprofit while we're working with local government to try and solve a childhood hunger issue. That's complex on its face.
Right.
And the simpler we could make that for the local government officials or the nonprofit that we were working with, or just the people on the ground who are benefiting from our services, the better. And I think using that simplifying concept is what enabled us to do a really good job from a communications perspective, but ultimately advance our business, and maybe more importantly, advance the cause that we were trying to advance, which was ending childhood hunger.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think not only was this simplification of the approach, figuring out what are the top 10 markets where we do most of our business and being focused, on those markets, it was also a simplification of message, because sometimes we were trying to say too much or too many things in one message. And I think that simplification is important. Which brings us to your next role, which was at St. Jude's. It was more of where marketing kind of came into your life to a certain extent, but it was also focused on a very specific community, those that are pediatric cancer or childhood cancer, and helping families in that environment. And I know St. Jude's is really well known as a brand, really well respected as a brand. What were the lessons you learned there? What were some of the communications approaches and particularly in support of the marketing of trying to get donations to help support the mission of the organization?
Yeah, great organization doing phenomenal work, doing absolutely phenomenal work. I will tell you a couple things I learned that come immediately to mind. One, you wouldn't necessarily think of a children's research hospital focused on childhood cancer as a place that has a power of positivity associated with it, but it does. It absolutely does. And the power of positivity works. It works on an individual level. It works on an organizational level. It works on a messaging level. Just the power of positivity is real. Just that idea of being positive, said a different way, not being negative. It's easy to slip into negativity or to be down and get further down. The power of positivity is real. It absolutely is. I'll say this in terms of the donations aspect of St. Jude. You're asking, um, not just Americans. I mean, folks worldwide to dig into their pocket and give $19 a month to be a sustainable giver to support the quest to end childhood cancer. And that's average guy or gal out there, $19 a month. You're asking folks to do that. And one of the things we learned was anticipating what that dynamic is, what's that calculus that folks make, and essentially it's an emotional appeal, and there's nothing wrong with an emotional appeal. But I think that was probably the real lesson learned for me was the power of positivity. How do we reach as many people as possible with an emotional appeal that resonates with them, that they can understand, that they can gravitate toward, and then actually take action and do something about? And then how do we facilitate that action for them? So it's kind of it starts from a place of positivity. There's the emotional side of it, and then there's the make it simple, create the pathway or the runway or the trajectory for folks to engage with your organization in something that they care deeply about.
So it's that power of the positivity comes from, the patient, the child, the
That's where it
parents,
starts.
the nurses, the
It's the
doctors, all
families,
the way up
exactly
to
what you're saying.
the leadership of the organization modeling that we're going to find a way, it's going to
Mhm,
work out.
mhm. That's
I think
true.
that's incredible. I've been in too many organizations sometimes where it's the power of fear. I'm doing things because I'm being motivated by the threat of losing my job or the threat of upsetting somebody and so I'm hoping more organizations sort of follow that model of, positivity. Yes. And how do we, take ideas, let mistakes happen, but we'll get to a better place after we get through some of the pain of failure. We'll learn from that and move forward. And so I love that takeaway from St. Jude, Steve. That's fantastic. And then sort of that leads into another community, which is where you are now as the president and CEO of Rappahannock Goodwill Industries. And that's absolutely a community based. But what I love about Goodwill Industries is this model. I think people are familiar with the Goodwill retail spaces they see and they frequent, but it's what that retail space supports that I find absolutely personally fantastic and incredible. And so I would love it if you could walk through a little bit of that model, and then we can talk a little bit more about that community engagement and stakeholder engagement that the Goodwill Industries does.
Sure. No, absolutely. In terms of the model, I'll say this. I mean, Goodwill has operated in the United States since 1902. So it's not like this started a couple of years ago. It's a tried and true model, and it's a self-sustaining business model that accepts donations from communities, all across the United States and Canada as well, for that matter, and then resells those donations, creates a resale marketplace to sell those donations. But then the dollars that come from that resale operation go back into the community in terms of job services. And all the services that Goodwills all across the United States and Canada offer are free of charge to the community. So you get, on average, you're getting into about 90 cents of every dollar going right back into the community that local Goodwill serves. So, I often tell folks, and I'll be honest with you, I just didn't know this, certainly not this way until I came to Goodwill. Goodwill is in the jobs business. Yes, we're in the donations business and the retail business, but ultimately we're in the jobs business because at the end of the day, that's what we do. We help folks through job training, through job credentialing, through job placement, through career navigation, through any number of aspects of employment. And particularly, we help folks who have barriers to employment overcome those barriers such that they then enter the workforce. And entering the workforce and frankly, staying in the workforce and moving up and through the workforce is good for anybody and everybody. So ultimately, Goodwill isn't in the jobs business. I'll give you one quick lesson, and then we can go where you'd like to go with this. It's one of these things. It's like you know it, but you don't necessarily think about it. But I kind of, I don't know if I relearned it or just became much more attuned to it when I came to Goodwill. It's just that idea of respect. Just respect. Everybody is somebody. Everybody is somebody, regardless of their circumstance, regardless of their current lot in life. Everybody is somebody. Everybody's got unique life experiences. Everybody's got a unique perspective. Everybody has something to teach us, meaning we can learn from everybody. And I will tell you just personally, my experience with Goodwill has been incredibly gratifying. It's been incredibly humbling, but I could not be happier with the opportunity, to kind of serve on the front line, on the ground in local communities across Central Virginia, helping people, pursue the jobs business. Because at the end of the day, there's a concrete outcome, and it's a win-win when we accomplish that goal.
No, it's fantastic. And I kind of think about, on the retail side, you're giving a chance to, to clothing, to things that somebody else can use. And in a way, this is giving an opportunity through the jobs market to folks that, can build that respect and dignity by having an opportunity to contribute to society, contribute their skills, for an employer, and for those employers to give a chance, that an ordinarily may not go to somebody because of perceptions and those
Right.
things. And what I see synergistically between this experience and Sodexo is also this idea of just people don't know what the organization does, and so storytelling, particularly that community engagement, I think is so important to let the community know this is where your efforts, your purchases help to do. And so I know we talked about some of the executions on some local activities, but can you give one example that folks might see how that works? How do you get the word out in the community?
Yeah, and I would tell you just with our Goodwill operation, there's literally not a week that goes by that we are not engaged in some form of community relations activity, and in some weeks we're doing something every single day. It's kind of one handshake at a time if you think about it that way. But I will tell you kind of my tact here, and this was also one of my lessons learned at Sodexo, was showing up matters. Showing up matters. As an organization, showing up matters. And then as an individual, from a leadership perspective, showing up matters. It really, really does. I'll give you one example, kind of one of our larger partnerships. And it's a fun partnership, and it's a winning partnership for everybody involved. We're partnered with the local baseball team. It's the Fredericksburg Nationals. The Fredericksburg Nationals are a minor league affiliate of the Major League Washington Nationals, and we partnered with the Fredericksburg Nationals at the outset of their time here in our area, which was about 4 years ago, and have since grown that partnership to the point where now every home game Wednesday, every Wednesday, it is literally called Goodwill Wednesday. So you come into the ballpark and the signage is Goodwill. You got your ticket. It's going to say Goodwill Wednesday on it. On the Jumbotron, our success stories play from some of our program participants, sharing their journey and their successes. We throw out the first pitch. We're on the radio broadcast. I've done both of those. I think I was okay at both of those. But that's an opportunity for us to get our brand in front of 2,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people on those game day evenings. And talk about who we are and what we do and why it's important and how people can engage with us, meaning give them a call to action.
Yeah, and I think then you start to see maybe donations go up, or purchases at retail
Exactly
spaces
right.
go up, or people knowing those services exist now, and maybe they have a family member that they tell, hey, here's a place you can go to get training, or that might help support this person. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's fantastic. I mean, and again, I think those partnerships are so important, and it gives you the license to operate right in the communities. I think that's something that's so essential for organizations these days. Steve, I wanted to talk about something that, and I appreciate you being willing to talk about this, but it's leading through what I would call personal tragedy. And I bring this up in the context of leadership, in particular in the changing dynamics of the workforce. With millennials and Generation Z coming into the workforce, and then we have now 5 generations between the boomers, Gen X, so there's all these different approaches and things that these different generations bring to the work. And in your case, you, during the time I think we knew each other, had a personal tragedy that you had to navigate while you were a leader of an organization and never knew about it as your employee, as your friend, as people at the workplace. But as a Gen Xer, I kind of understand you leave your personal things at home and your work things at work. I want to ask if you could talk a little bit about that and your perspective on sort of leadership and people, what they should do with things that are happening in their lives, whether they bring them work or.
Yeah, a couple things I'll offer on this. Just to be clear, my son, had addiction issues for probably close to 10 years. Ultimately, took his own life, and that doesn't qualify me to be an expert in anything. What it means is I've had that experience. That said, I'll go back to a point that I was making about my opportunity to serve with the Goodwill team. It's that idea that everybody is somebody, everybody is a unique individual. Everybody has a perspective. Everybody's got life experiences. And from a leadership perspective, you have to go beyond simply acknowledging that to, kind of incorporating that. If you think about it, I'll kind of get a bridge over to accommodating, because there's a point there where you want to accommodate someone's issues or needs or whatever the case may be, but you've got to balance that with the business or the operations, those types of things. And that's a real balance from a leader perspective. But I would also offer, I think it starts with, you have to acknowledge it from a leader perspective. It is real. Everybody's got life stuff going on. Everybody has life stuff going on. It's just the way it is. And from a organizational cultural perspective, the more you can support that, the extent to which you can accommodate that, creates a positive culture that can move forward together, accomplish goals, accomplish the mission, deliver service, or whatever the case may be. I'll go back to a point I made earlier in kind of my approach to life stuff, to issues, has really been around that idea of listen, learn, and then lead. The more I know, the better decision I can make, and the better I can move toward positive outcome for the individual, positive outcome for the organization. But I think this really comes down to the idea that you have to acknowledge there are issues. And then as a leader, you have to be willing to move forward with those issues, because it's not a matter of, well, if you ignore the issues, it's not as if they're not there. They're still there. You just ignored them. You haven't solved anything. You haven't moved anything forward. You haven't helped anybody. So I do think there is an aspect of acknowledging and then listening, learning, before you lead. And Enrico, I can go a number of different directions on that, but that's kind of the way I approach things now. I'd like to tell you that's the way I've always approached things. I think I've probably gotten better over time and with different experiences, but I think there's a requirement to acknowledge it. And then once you acknowledge it as a leader, there's a requirement to do something with it, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting dynamic that's playing out now, particularly again with the millennials and Gen Zs. They feel very comfortable, I think, as mental health become more common discussion, in society. So you have athletes that are acknowledging the stresses that from a mental standpoint, and so they're withdrawing from competitions and they're being public about it. And I think in the workplace, you have more and more comfort and people talking to their managers and saying, listen, I'm having this difficult time in my personal life. Could I get extra time on this project, or could I get more resources to help me get through this project? That was something unheard of, 10 years ago, even, where particularly for, older generations, where you just would never feel comfortable acknowledging that it was just about getting the work done. I think it's an interesting perspective in the workplace to see how leaders should handle that, whether adapting to it, like you just said, helps to achieve a little bit more loyalty and motivation for your employees, because they really do feel like then you are part of a family, as we always talk about a lot of times in organizations. You spend a lot of time there. But then at what point does that become a distraction from the mission of the organization as well? And how do you balance that accommodation, but also achieving the goals?
And again, I think listening creates the opportunity for action. That doesn't mean everything's going to be successful and you're going to resolve every issue. But if you don't, from a leader perspective, if you don't know about it, there's nothing that you can do about it. So I think listening creates the opportunity for action, which creates the opportunity for success.
Well, appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's just an important dynamic for leaders to think about, this change that's happening, this generational change that's happening in the workplace. And it's something that I think they're going to have to navigate. And the approach they take is going to be determinant of the success of the organization, I believe, and particularly in retention of talent. Well, Steve, we're coming to the close of the program, and I just wanted to leave our listeners with some of the takeaways of what we talked about today, in particular in leadership, and some of the things that I have loved hearing from you today. Listen, learn, and lead, I think was a great takeaway for anybody who's managing a leader of an organization. I think we talked about being authentic in your leadership, being transparent, and what that can do to ensure more success, particularly from a communication standability. As we talked, I think if you don't adapt, as you mentioned, Steve, in the new dynamics, both in the workplace and listen, even with the AI of things, adapting to what that might mean for the workplace. And then ultimately in that intersection that we begin with today, that intersection of leadership and communications, I think understanding the value of communications and how it can really help an organization meet its strategic goals. And so understanding how to resource that properly, to support that properly, what that means into the success of an organization, I think is important. And I think your example of being the right leader at the right place at the right time throughout your career and being able to manage the mission of the organizations, proves that. And so I hope the takeaway for some of the CEOs and leaders out there is to value the communications function, whether that's public relations, marketing, advertising. They're there to tell your story strategically. They're there to keep you out of trouble, to protect your brand, to build your brand awareness. And so I think it was Bill Gates that talked about the fact that if he had, $1, in a budget left, he would put it towards public relations. And I think that's very insightful as well. So Steve, I want to thank you again so much. It was so great to reconnect with you. I appreciate you coming onto the show and sharing your experience. I hope this was painless for you.
Enrico, this is fantastic. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation about leadership and communications and then the intersection between the two. A fantastic opportunity. Thank you for having me.
So for our audience, I just want to say thank you for joining the Commsversation. Again, this is a forum for those who have an interest in this topic. We're really looking at the trends, the best practices, the lessons learned. You can find more information at commsversations.com. That's COMMSversations.com. And from there, you can link to all the places you love to listen and view your podcasts. Until next time, thank you for joining the conversation.